Well, there have been a lot of games and a lot of trends are starting in certain directions. Some teams are taking off, some teams are slowing down. What does it all mean? We're about halfway through the season, so it's time for our mid-season Puck Drop podcast.
It's time for the PWHL Puck Drop Podcast.
That's right. Believe it or not, most teams are about halfway through their season with 12 games played each, and there've been some hot, some cold, some holding steady. So today I wanted to take a look at just some of the numbers, the trends, some of the players that have either been hot or cold. What's your team been up to? Who's been the MVP for your team so far? So up at the top, it seems to me in the first tier, we've got two teams, Minnesota and Montreal. It might look a little artificial right now, but it has been shaping up that way for the past 4 or 5 games. So Montreal has 24 points. Minnesota has 21. Let's take a look at Montreal first. They have had, to me, the most surprising results. Some games they've won where they shouldn't have won. It's just been a fascinating team to watch from top to bottom, beginning to end. They started off the season with an overtime win against Ottawa, and that pretty much showed you what you were going to get from them. It was hanging on, it was playing defensive hockey, it was waiting for that moment to strike, and that's what they've been doing ever since. They went 1 win, 1 loss, 1 win, 1 loss for about their first 6 or 7 games. So they were, pretty much about as average as you can be until we hit the shootout game against Toronto, which they ended up losing 4-3. But that game had a lot of implications for both teams. Marie-Philippe Poulin, of course, scored that beautiful tying goal. And then after that, they went into the Xcel Energy Center and beat Minnesota 2-1 with Elaine Chuli's great win. They beat Ottawa 2-1. They beat Boston with Chuli in goal again at the Tsongas Center 2-1. Then they did lose the battle on Bay Street at Scotiabank Arena, but came right back with another great win against Minnesota. They ended up losing in a shootout to New York, and then their latest game was a statement win in Verdun against Ottawa. So to me, it was that stretch in late January and right into February before the rivalry series break that Montreal started to come into its own. And you definitely have to look at their goaltending as one of the biggest factors. Who thought that Elaine Chuli would be the top goalie right now with a goals against of 1.24 and a save percentage of 0.961. Those are both tops in the league over second place Corrine Schroeder, who does have an amazing save percentage as well, 0.949. But no slouch, and Renee Desbiens, who has played 9 games total and has a 923 save percent average and a 2.16 goals against average. So both of them are really playing lights out. And then when you couple that with, of course, Marie-Philippe Poulin, who has 12 points in 13 games, a nice even 6-6, unarguably the best player in the game, and then some great secondary or support scoring at least. Maureen Murphy's been a great surprise, if you want to call it that. She is playing with Poulin, but 3 goals and 7 assists, 10 points for her. And Teresa Vanisheva, another great story. She got her second goal in the win against Ottawa. So she's got 2 goals and 8 assists for 10 points as well in 12 games. And you can't call Laura Stacey a sleeper, but with 6 goals and 2 assists, I think that's a little more offensive output than we might have expected from her. When you look at Montreal's top scorers, I'm going to kind of do a cutoff of 6 points in 13 games played. I think that's a good cutoff, and Montreal has 6 players above that cutoff point. Claire Dalton just makes it with her 5 goals and 1 assist, but that is saying something when you've got that many players contributing. And Erin Ambrose is the only defender, but with 2 goals, 5 assists, 7 points in 13 games played, I think that speaks well for her. So that's been Montreal's trend, kind of a slow build with a bit of a spurt in the middle that has just carried them as they've kind of evened out lately. And joining Montreal in that top tier is, of course, Minnesota, who have been on top pretty much from day one of the league since they went undefeated in their first 5 games. They did lose in overtime to New York, and then they finally did lose in regulation to Montreal 2-1. So if we look at their 6-point scorers, they have 5 of them. Zumwinkle, Panic, Coyne, Schofield, Taylor Heise, and Lee Steckline. They did have Susanna Tapani on pace for that. She has 5 points in her 9 games played with Minnesota, and of course she was traded to Boston. So maybe a little bit less than the other teams, but their scoring has been pretty spread out. You've got a lot of players with, in the 2-3 point range. And of course, they added Sophie Jakes in that trade, who got an assist in her very first game with Minnesota, and who I think is going to make a big difference for them on the blue line, especially on the power play. Abby Boreen has been a nice surprise. She has been activated now that Taylor Heise has been placed on LTIR. That allows them to keep Boreen on the active list, and she's been a really, really nice surprise. I think Liz Sheppers has been a really strong player for them. Maybe her points aren't quite there, but whatever line she's on seems to really be taking off. And Grace Zumwinkle, who we talked about, is, I think, one of the surprises of the league, although, the hat trick that she got maybe skewed her stats only slightly, but she's been very, very noticeable. She's been, Hensley and Maddie Rooney have been definitely underrated if possible, or at least undermentioned as far as being among the top goalies in the league. Nicole Hensley is sitting basically at third as far as goals against average of 1.84, and Rooney's in fifth at 1.98. In save percentage, Nicole Hensley again is in third. Rooney's down a little further at eighth at 911. But, Hensley's been a great surprise. And the thing about goaltending is that we didn't know with many of these players who hadn't played a strong regular schedule since their NCAA college playing days, many of them. They might have played in the PWHPA, but that was a more limited schedule, and they didn't play every game, obviously. Some of them were either second or third on their national team. And so coming out of something like that and then taking a little time to get off the ground and get started is a bit of a roll of the dice for these GMs. But definitely credit to Natalie Darwitz for realizing that she needed to grab Nicole Hensley early on in the draft. And she's been one of the better draft picks overall, period. About the only games that we've seen Minnesota struggle in were the 2-1 losses against Montreal. And in that case, Montreal played Elaine Chuli in both of those. So that's interesting that she was able to hold Minnesota to just 1 goal. It would certainly make for an interesting storyline if they met each other in the playoffs, which goalie would be starting for Montreal and how they would do there. And then quickly just mentioning the trade as far as Minnesota's trajectory through the season. I think that it's interesting that Darwitz and Marmer both said they didn't want to make a small trade, a trade of just minimal players that might not have that much of an impact on the roster. They didn't want to uproot players, make them move locations and change teams just for the sake of, finishing out a third line or playing small minutes on defense or something like that. They wanted to make a trade that they both thought would really improve their team. So they went for somewhat of a blockbuster with Jakes for Tapani and Abby Cook. And it's worked out really well for both. I think Jakes is a really good fit here. The injury to Heise maybe makes it a little unfortunate that they don't have Tapani around, but they are able to activate Boreen, so that should offset that a little bit. Right now, their playoff chances are at 91%, and that's about where you'd expect to see them. A 46% chance to make the final and a 23% chance to be the PWHL champion. So overall, looking good. And then, of course, if you're going to talk hot teams, you got to talk Toronto. Not only did they win that battle on Bay Street, but they are on a 5-game winning streak, if you count the shootout. And they have the hottest goaltender in the league. Who would have thought? Kristen Campbell. She, was making us all question the fact that Toronto only took her basically as their number 1 goalie in the draft. And she didn't start off that strongly. You can go back to my videos where I said they look great. They chose a lot of Team Canada veterans, but did they forget about goaltending? And what I meant was a strong secondary goaltender that looked like most teams had someone with enough experience, either playing for their national teams or collegiately, that if the number one needed a break, they would have it. And Toronto has Erica Howe, who is pretty much what I would call a B goalie, a backup goalie. She can take a start now and then, but it was all on Campbell's shoulders. And at first, she wasn't looking so good. They got beat in their first game 4-0 by New York, and it just seemed to go from there. Losing to Minnesota, Ottawa, Boston, Montreal, they were able to beat New York. It seemed like this shootout game against Montreal on the 20th, where Campbell stopped 3 out of the 4 shootout attempts by Marie-Philippe Poulin. You could almost just read that and see that happening in front of your eyes, that she was gaining confidence, kind of remembering how she used to be able to stop good players in big situations. And that was, to me, the turning point. In the very next game, she shut out New York. They won against Minnesota. They won against Boston. She got another shutout in the battle on Bay Street, 3-0 over Montreal. And then they were able to beat New York in that shootout again. So the second shootout win for Campbell. Her save percentage right now sits at a tidy 918, and her goals against is 220. And that's saying something when you look at her earlier save percentage and goals against average. I mean, this game, she was at a 727. That's the game where she was pulled. And then it just starts to go up from there. So great credit to her. And looking at our 6-point scores for Toronto, they also have 5. The cutoff is right here with Hannah Miller, who missed 1 game and has 5 points, but she's heating up. So you've surprisingly got Jocelyn Larocque there with 6 points herself, and Emma Malte, who's been just a little bit of everything for this team in a good way. She has 2 goals and 5 assists for 7 points in her 12 games. And look who's on top. Of course, it's Natalie Spooner, the league's leading goal scorer, 10 goals, 1 assist, 11 points. So pretty strong overall. And you've got players playing a secondary role like Maggie Connors, Blair Turnbull, you think has to heat up a little bit more than that even. Hannah Miller's been a great revelation. And Victoria Bach, who's only played 4 games, I think she'll be joining those top scorers as well. And with that pair of Larocque and Fast finally coming to where we thought they would and hoped they would, I think Toronto is much more where they belong, where we thought they'd be. And if we look at this chart of their daily playoff chances, wow, it's a roller coaster, or it's going down into the valley and back up, because with those early losses into the end of January, they just plunged to the bottom. I think they were at something like a 15% chance to make the playoffs. And quickly with that game against Montreal, they've climbed back up, and the 5-game win streak certainly hasn't hurt at all. Right now, they're sitting in third with a 73% chance to make the playoffs. And then looking at New York, to me, they are just about what we expected. This is the identity that they seem to have right from the start. Exciting to watch. A couple of really big stars. I mean, Alex Carpenter, we knew she was good, but put her in this environment and she has just thrived. So with all that talent, I think New York is going to be right in the thick of things all season long. Even though Boston has jumped out by 2 points ahead of them after their last game, it looks like Toronto, Boston, New York are probably going to be the teams that are fighting for those last 2 playoff spots. One interesting trend with them is they definitely have gone past regulation the most. They have 4 overtime games and 3 wins and 1 loss in those. And they've already been to a shootout twice with 1 win and 1 loss. So they're picking up extra points even when they don't get the 3 for the regulation win. So they have 2 regulation wins, 4 overtime wins, 2 overtime losses, and 4 regular losses. So they seem to go literally almost 1 win, 1 loss, alternating. On February 4th, when they played in Ottawa, Ottawa jumped out to a 3-0 lead, and then as it looked like they were going to finish it out, scored 3 goals in the second half of the third period. So at 14:54, Abby Rock scored. Less than a minute later, Jade Downey-Landry scored. And then about a minute after that, Alex Carpenter scored. So they went to overtime at 3-3. And it was, of course, overtime hero Alex Carpenter who got the winner for them there. Games like that, when we look at the league, if something like that happens, it's usually involving New York. And when we look at our 6-point cutoff, this is the team that is loaded with scorers. They actually have 6 players that have 6 points or more as of right now, and 2 of them have more than 10. That's Ella Shelton with 10, 4 goals, 6 assists, and Alex Carpenter, the leading scorer of the league, with 8 goals, 7 assists. Then we've got Jessie Eldridge with 4 and 4 for 8 points. Abby Rock with 2 goals, 6 assists for 8 points. Jade Downey-Landry 4 and 2 for 6 points. And a defenseman, Jamie Bourbonnais, with 1 goal and 5 assists. So there's a lot of offense there. And then at the same time, you know that this team would not be where they are without the goaltending of Corrine Schroeder. She is one of the top goalies in the league. Her goals against right now is 1.71, and her save percentage is 0.949. So she's been just, lights out from the first game where she posted a shutout and continues to just be strong all the way through. I don't think her play has dipped at all, and that earned her a call up to Team Canada for the rivalry series. So the playoff chance chart for New York has been pretty similar to a team like Montreal, where they've gone 1 up, 1 down, and stayed pretty much where they are. If you look at the beginning and the end, they are right now at about a 63% chance to make the playoffs. And really the only dip they had was when they did have a 2-game losing streak for the only time this season. And then as far as making the finals, they are at about 31%, and to be champion, it looks like a 15%. And so, like I said, the pack of New York, Toronto, and Boston, I think, are going to be the 3 that are sticking close together and trying to get those last spots. Now, with Ottawa, you'd have to say it's a surprise that they're at the bottom. I mean, that's where they are. Unfortunately, those overtime losses where they only got a single point starting with their very first game of the season, which is what happened, has just been the story for them so far. I don't really know what to chalk it up to. I think their goaltending has been really good. Maschmeyer has maybe borne a little bit too much of the load. Maybe that's some of what's going on. I just can't fault her for the games. To me, they had the best looking decor, but there have been a little bit of shaky moments for players like Jinsey Rose and Zoe Boyd. I think Ashton Bell's been really good. Savannah Harmon's been really good. Tara Lova's been really good. They obviously had the breakout star in Lexi Agia, but she's cooled off just a little bit. And for me, actually, their most consistent player, other than Emily Clark, has been Katerina Mrazova. She's just been kind of a wild card that showed up and has just been playing at a strong A- level, let's call it. I mean, Lexi Agia went up to A+. I think now she's back down to a B+. But Mrazova's just been fun to watch, and so has her Czech teammate, Teralova. And the interesting thing is, with that 6-point cutoff, Ottawa actually has 7 players that would make it. And that's unusual since they're in last place, but it shows you that they've got the offensive firepower. They're just not timing their goals. They're not coming up with big goals. So we basically, if we start at 6 points, we've got Savannah Harmon and Brianne Jenner, both with 2 goals and 4 assists. Dara Watts has 6 points with her 3 goals and 3 assists. Mrazova has 6 points with 4 goals and 2 assists. And so does Gabby Hughes, 4 goals, 2 assists. Then we've got 7 points for Emily Clark with 2 and 5, and 7 points for Lexi Agia with 4 goals and 3 assists. Now, it's notable when you look at the number beside that they all have a negative number in the plus minus, and Jenner, Harmon, Watts, and Mrazova are all at -4. So you can look at that and say, are these important players on the ice when goals are needed and getting scored against? I don't think there have been that many empty net goals that have counted there. I think these are pressing to either tie the game or when they're out there needing a goal and it doesn't happen, or they're getting themselves behind by just not playing well in the defensive zone. So that's an interesting stat picture to look at for this team. And so the trend for this team is an unfortunate one. It's overtime, extra time games where they don't have a single overtime or shootout win, and they have 4 overtime losses. And those are just points that they have left on the board, and they've come in some really painful ways with disputed calls, last-second goals, games where they're ahead and then they get tied up and lose. So they have 3 regulation wins, 0 overtime wins, 4 overtime losses, and 5 regulation losses. It just is what it is at this point. I mean, you would think with a few extra points in those games, they would be more in the thick of things, but it's now points that they're going to have to make up. Looking closely at it, the game on January 17th, they were up 2-0 in the first period against Minnesota, and they got tied up and lost in overtime in that one. January 24th against Boston, they were actually down 2-0 and then were able to tie it 2-2 and then lost with 52 seconds left when Teresa Schaffsal scored for Boston. So they came away with 0 when, it looked like they were at least going to salvage a point or even 2 out of that one. We've already talked about the February 4th game against New York where they were up 3-0 and watched it slip away late in the third period and then lost in overtime. So for those efforts, they get a mere 1 point. These are reasons that teams fall behind and can't make it up. I'm really hoping they can figure something out, but it just is starting to have a look of a trend. And then, when it gets in players' minds, it becomes a really difficult thing. The other thing that has hurt them was the home and home series against Minnesota, where they lost both of those by a score of 2-1. So there's not much else to say looking at the trend line for Ottawa. They just have not been picking up points. They were initially thought that, they have games in hand and maybe they'll be able to make that up. But as they've made them up, the results haven't come. So they have been hovering definitely around the bottom, and they are in last in points, last in playoff chances, and last in odds to make the playoffs and win the championship. So let's take a look at Boston and see kind of what's been going wrong, should I say, or going on anyway. What an interesting, frustrating, surprising team they've been. We all thought from looking at the draft that this was the team on paper that did the best. They drafted Alina Mueller, obviously, at third. That was a stroke of luck. They drafted Sophie Jakes. They drafted Emma Soderberg. They drafted Jamie Lee Rattray. They already had Megan Keller, Hillary Knight, Erin Frankel looked like one of the best free agent trios going. Why aren't they at the top? So the good news for Boston is they have jumped out ahead of New York by 2 points. So things are starting to look up for them, and you'd have to think they would. If we do the 6-point cutoff with them, they have 5, and actually nobody has 6 exactly. We have 3 players with 7 and 2 points, or 2 players with 10 points. We have Jamie Lee Rattray with 2 and 5 for 7. We have Tapani with 3 and 4 for 7, and Lauren Gable 4 and 3 for 7. And then Alina Mueller has 2 goals and 8 assists for 10 points. And the no doubt team MVP Megan Keller, a defenseman, 3 goals and 7 assists for 10 points. So Tapani joining that list is definitely a plus. What you think about them losing Sophie Jakes is, kind of a matter of other discussion. She didn't have any points in her 7 games, but I think the talking point here for Boston is really just one thing, and it's Hillary Knight. She's played her 12 games, 2 goals and 2 assists. She had an overtime winner for her first goal against Minnesota, and then a goal in the latest win against Ottawa. So she didn't play all that great in the last games of the rivalry series. Some have speculated that she might have an injury. She doesn't really look like full power, like she's got that 5th gear. She looks like she's getting up to about fourth gear. And I don't know if it starts to mentally wear on you that you're not doing as well as you're usually expected, or if there's something else going on. But to me, that's where the success of this team is really gonna lie, is if she can get herself up there in, the at least half a point per game, and more goals than assists. Really, we need her firing on all cylinders. So they've shifted their lines around with the addition of Tapani. I believe she was the first line center in their last game, and she's looked really good. Gable has looked good. They've mixed things around a little bit, trying to find the right line mates for Knight and for Mueller, whether playing them together or not. Hannah Brandt usually plays well with Hillary Knight. And then another storyline that I'm watching is Sophie Shirley, hoping that she can come back after that apparent head injury where she collided with the stanchion. I think she was becoming a really important player, and with her performance in the rivalry series with Canada showed that she's really got some tools for success. So hopefully she can come back without too much problem. And then in their last game, Erin Frankel showed really well. She got that shutout. So goaltending doesn't look like a problem for them, although Emma Soderberg, to me, has underperformed just a touch. Maybe an extra win from her could have helped them be up higher in the standings. So everything is so close with, one game and the 3 points on the line that it's really just, it's tight going. But if they've turned the corner with these 2 wins in a row, I think that'll keep them in the mix for the playoffs and maybe even the finals. I am just known for my great predictions, and I picked them to win the whole thing. It's still possible. It's only halfway through the season. So the trend for Boston was pretty much staying right there with that, middle of about 4 teams until they lost a couple of games and kind of, bottomed out right around the rivalry series, and now a bit of an upturn. So they're at 47% to make the playoffs, 24% to make the final, and 12% to be the overall champion. So I wouldn't count them out yet, and especially if we keep an eye on their high-end talent and whether they can make a turnaround. So that's about it for this week. We might vary on when we do this podcast, whether it's on the weekend or on a Monday to recap you on all the games. And depending on who joins me, I'm glad to have a chance to do this here today and just look over the stats with you and kind of get you the 30,000 feet view from up above what's been going on, in case you've been caught up in the details of watching your favorite team, just kind of cheering for points. But there are a lot of underlying statistics and trends and things that might have an effect upcoming. My bold prediction of Boston finishing first and Montreal finishing last, I did say you could take it and flip it and it would still be correct. And really, maybe I was just being ironic. So that's the podcast for this week. Take me at my word. Take me at the upside down of my word. It's all good. We're here to enjoy, watch, support PWHL hockey. And that's a wrap for this episode.
PWHL
Hey, we'll see you in the next one.
Puck Drop Podcast.